This is Kai Mariyama. Gonna talk for a little bit for our American history class for a final project here on a rather interesting issue, California gun control. It's fairly often, you know, portrayed in such a way that is being very, very restrictive, which compared to the rest of the country, it very much is. Very often vilified by conservative, generally pro-gun groups, especially such as the NRA, and is to the point of being the butt of quite a few jokes. But what I'm going to be addressing here, and not the morality or anything political about those laws themselves, is how these laws came to be in the first place. So initially in the 60s, California did not have any of these gun control laws. It was very relaxed in that regard, not any more than the rest of the country, however. What happened around those times, though, is that increasing racial violence, lots of civil rights movement was happening, and people were becoming aware and empowered, especially black people, minorities. And so, as a response to lots of police brutality and killings of minorities, black people in particular, a group was started, the Black Panther Party. It's essentially started as a group of black people who owned guns and who effectively established themselves as the police for the police. They would walk around their neighborhoods, they would follow around police who were there, and whenever they would make an arrest, the Panthers would stand over to the side with their guns, shouting out direction to the person, telling them they had the right to remain silent, that the Panthers were watching, and if anything happened, they'd be there to protect them. And so, effectively, they were the police. The normal police were not particularly happy to discover that this was a thing they could do, but they had researched the laws, and it was perfectly legal for them, being full citizens of the United States and all that, to walk around carrying loaded firearms under open carry laws. So generally, law enforcement, government, white people in general were not particularly happy about this. The Black Panthers were fairly militant, though they rarely resorted to violence most of the time, especially in the early days. And so they started talking about legislation. A major, essentially the state government of California, which was Republican at the time, the governor was Ronald Reagan, they got together and created a bill that essentially, it was called the Mulford Act, and it would ban open carry of loaded firearms. Very, very clearly targeted at the Black Panthers. And the main sponsor of this bill was the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which in modern day is basically, they will fight anything even remotely close to regulating guns or gun control or anything along those lines. So not their usual or their current stance on this issue. So after this happens, Black Panthers, realizing they're being targeted, set out to do something about it. So they decide to get together, according to a news report that happened at the time, about 40 Negroes armed with loaded rifles, shotguns, and pistols walked into the state capitol. A half dozen went into the assembly chamber while the House was in session. They identified themselves as members of the Black Panther Party from Oakland, Berkeley, and Richmond, and said they were protesting racist Oakland police and demonstrating for the right to bear arms. State Capitol Police herded the men out of the chamber and took some of their guns away. Effectively, they showed up at the Capitol with guns and started protesting. There was no violence, everything was fine, but it scared the crap out of people. It was in your face. I mean, it's threatening. They have lethal weapons, and it's not an issue you can ignore anymore when they're in your face. So, in response to this, the California state government that day passed the Mulford Act and added provisions banning bringing guns into the state capitol. It was, again, primarily sponsored by the National Rifle Association and specifically signed and passed by the governor, Ronald Reagan, at the time. And this was basically the first major gun control legislation that was passed in California, and ended up leading to a long series of current things that were influenced by other occurrences, but this was sort of that initial snowball that kicked off the very extreme gun control legislation that exists in California. So there you go. Republicans were the ones who implemented most of the gun control that they now complain about so much in California. That's probably something you haven't heard about before.